this is Till Novak. I'm presenting you a little screen recording of a workflow which I like to use very often. It's not a step-by-step tutorial, it's more a real-time recording of how I work, and I'm giving you some comments on it. This workflow is very cheaty, which means it's not a professional workflow for modeling and UV mapping. It's more like a trick to get fast, nice looking results. And actually for my short film delivery, that's exactly the way I modeled all the buildings in the scene you see here. They were all modeled this way, very, very fast, and I need that trick very often because it's you only have a day to build 10 buildings, and then you need a fast way instead of modeling every little detail. I start in Photoshop just with one photo, and if I'm lucky, the sky can be selected with this magic stick in Photoshop, so I can very fast make the sky black and the building white, so I have my opacity map. Then I go to 3D Studio Max and apply the image on a simple plane and use the black and white map to make the sky transparent. And then I begin to push and drag the vertices to match some significant edges within the photo. So I'm selecting vertices and moving them to match edges I see in the photo. Therefore, I first had to set the plane subdivisions a bit higher. You can add more edges later, so it's not important how many lines you have in the beginning exactly, just roughly estimated. And you see I can move the vertices without moving, without distorting the image. And the reason is because I have an UV map modifier above the edit poly modifier in the stack. You can see that on the right side. So I'm working on the edit poly modifier before the UV mapping, so I can move the vertices without distorting the image. The philosophy behind this workflow is just to do something which is not very different from what live action filmmakers do. To look for a location where the buildings that you need for your set already exist and just use them instead of creating everything on your own. Now I'm using a second edit poly modifier above the edit poly modifier I already have, just to make the poly selection, which I'm just doing at the moment, not come through until the UV map modifier. So the UV mapping stays still absolutely independent from what I'm doing in the edit poly modifier. Now I'm still tweaking and moving the vertices to match the image. And now I'm first time extruding faces, which I've selected before to bring the third dimension into this. So I'm selecting just parts from the image by poly selection, which I think could come out of the geometry. There are not certain rules which parts I extrude, it's just I go intuitively with the image I see and just add some more detail out of my fantasy. Now I wanted to select the windows, but I see that there are not enough polys, so I cut in another line. Now I can select the windows. First the upper row, now the lower row, and now I use extrude again to push the windows in the building. So that's what I have now. It's a little three-dimensional already. Now I'm deleting polygons which are only consisting transparency, so I don't need them anymore. Bringing even more depth into it by just pushing and dragging some parts. And now I'm doing this above the UV mapping, so now the UV mapping is distorted by everything I move. On purpose, of course, because now I'm beginning to do more refining, and I'm in the third dimension already, so I can distort how I want. And now that's something I like a lot. It's I just detach two polys with the texture information on it, and I copy it several times and attach it again. So the texture which was mapped to this two polys is also copied, or three polys, I don't know. And it looks like a lot of detail later, but it isn't. It's only low poly with some texture. Now I use the shell modifier to make it double-sided. Otherwise the polys would have been only one-sided and only visible from one side. Now I go back to a edit poly modifier very low in the stack, so what I do here influences everything I do later, so I can still tweak some things like direction and sizes of parts. Now I begin to fake that this is not only one side, it's a corner of the building, using the symmetry modifier in a 45-degree angle to build a corner. And of course this is, to use symmetry to build a whole building is a bit cheaty, but what if you have only one day to build 10 buildings? Then this is a good solution. And of course later you can attach more detail and more things to make it not look so symmetrical. Just finding the right position. Now I'm copying, scaling and moving, and sometimes also rotating the whole thing to make it look like a complex of buildings, a second story, and so I basically always do something and double what I did, and double this again, and double this again, with slight tweaks like rotation and scale, so then you get very fast, high amount of detail. So this is the final building. Here you see how low poly it is, so you can build a whole city like that without getting too much geometry, but from if you are not too close to these buildings, they look perfect in the rendering. All depends on the quality of the image you use. And here you see in a later stage of the project how I attached another part which I had built exactly the same, using the same workflow to build something like a little science fiction train station. And if you do that, stick together parts like that, then nobody sees that it's all symmetrical and all repeating. So you have to break up the repeating appearance of everything, and then it looks like you have an incredible amount of detail which you never modeled. So let the work do the opacity maps and the textures, and not model everything yourself. That's at least what works good for me in most of my projects. And here you see the train made from the same image like the building. It's the same image. Maybe you recognize some these parts here, these lattice parts are the same. Okay, so here you can see the final scenes in which I used exactly this kind of low poly models. And of course lighting and compositing is very important to make it look good in the end. And this was just my way to make quick little buildings from only one photograph. And if you are interested to know more about this little short film, you can visit me at framebox.com.